As I've said before, when it comes to schools of duality, people think of it as opposites when really it shouldn't be considered an opposite. It's something that gives you meaning to one or the other. In other words, the sun and moon, are they really opposites? If you think about it, if a moon got really huge and got to a certain mass, it'd just become a sun, wouldn't it? So when we use these things, they're just, heavenly bodies. Is the sun opposite of Jupiter or something like that? No. Celestial bodies are celestial bodies. But when we say the sun and the sun gives the moon meaning, and the moon gives the sun meaning in a way because of day and night. The sun represents day, and the moon represents night. And we'll consider these things opposite, but once again, they're not exactly opposites, but they define one another through relevance. So the sun, day, and so forth is relatively different than night, the moon. So these two things get intertwined in their meanings because one helps define the other. And that's another way of saying it. It helps define one another. So when one can help define the other and the other can help define the other, so these things go back and forth. They have a connection. They are a pair, a coupling. I've explained this before, but I just wanted to reiterate that because when I start explaining this next concept and how to use school of duality to actually use it for effectively kind of like a spiritual warfare or a spiritual tactics. This is one of the things that you use. One of the standard tactics of preventing something from mounting an attack against you or whatnot is to divide it, to weaken it. And one of the things that's usually a concept is people. How best to divide a people, how best to weaken a people. And the important thing about understanding this is that when you understand this is how you weaken them and how all this other stuff, you understand kind of almost in an intuitive way how to also strengthen them. And also how to recognize these tactics when they're used against you and your own. So, when it comes to counteracting these things, you must understand their proper use. So, when it comes to a people, I want you to think about what does it mean to have a duality with people? What is a people's, people would say, what is an opposite of people? Non-people, animals, so forth. And I would say, continually say, that's why I bring up the original stuff. It's not an opposite. It is what gives people a meaning. What is something out there that actually helps you define what people are? That is not necessarily people in the same sense. Once again, the sun and the moon are both celestial bodies made of matter. They're not technically that different. In the sense, it's they're both celestial bodies. So something can be one people versus another people. You can say, what is that? Kind of a similar deal. I'm you have to take it a little bit further than that. So when it comes to people, think of something that gives people meaning. And in a sense of what defines you as a person. Well, when I say people also give people meaning. Like you say, you have to be a little more specific. Well, if you have one nation of people, which is just saying people twice effectively, then you have other nations of people, aka people, other people. You now start to understand those people are divided among lines like that. So, and to be a very blunt way of saying it, people are defined by their enemies. They're defined by what they oppose as not them. And an enemy is something that you don't let in. Thus, if you let them in, aren't they kind of you? So, a people is defined by its enemies. It's very important to understand this, because once you do, you realize the importance of an enemy. If you do not have an enemy, you do not have a people. Because then everyone's your people. There are no enemies. And if there's no enemies, there are no people. And this is when you start understanding that enemies, in that sense, actually define people. You're defined by your enemies. And, what you believe are your enemies, which is the same thing as your enemies. You're defined by that. Your people are defined by their enemies. So, in a really simple and strange way of understanding duality, if someone was to take away your enemy, or reduce them to a point where you no longer consider them an enemy, they actually change the definition of your people. So when it comes to divide and conquer strategies here, one of the best ways to divide and conquer is to remove people's clear enemies from their vision or sight, to obfuscate that, so they can no longer see, obscure, the sight of their enemies, or eliminate them for them. And once those enemies are gone, people are going to try to fill that void. They're going to draw new battle lines, new national lines, draw new nations, new borders. And thus, maintaining your enemies and maintaining their borders is actually important to maintaining your people. So this comes down to like the understanding that eventually, if you don't maintain your enemies, your friends will eventually become your enemies. This is why, and kind of like how complacency breeds certain things or whatnot, but it's more like when you don't have an active enemy, you'll find new ones. You have to have an enemy. Effectively, it doesn't have to be necessarily a bad one, and when you get to spiritual matters, you can have spiritual enemies and whatnot. But the point being is that when you have a large nation of people and you remove their enemy, you're going to divide that nation. Not directly, but they'll divide themselves, which will weaken them. Thus, if you want to actually weaken a nation, and this is using advanced duality school understandings, you want to weaken a nation, eliminate their enemies, and that's all. And then watch as the nation crumbles, because without their enemies, they will eventually crumble. As the statement kind of goes, steel sharpens steel, and your enemies keep you strong. For if you don't have them, you'll eventually become weak. And the reality is that it's not that you just become weak in a sense of like a body or whatnot not fighting. It's that you become weak because now your brother becomes your enemy. Instead of looking to the foreign invader, you're going to look to your brother Abel and say, I want that wife over there. And this is how you make a nation of Cains, by taking away their enemies. And then they'll look at their brothers and want to, covet, die, whatever. And it's really sad because at the end of the day, most people are just a nation of Cains. They're one enemy away, losing one enemy from being, a nation of Cains, being a house divided against itself. Your enemies keep you strong, and that's why you don't want the destruction of your enemies. You want to compete against them. You want to rival against them. But if someone was to destroy them, once again, to upset this balance, because it is an important balance between nations. When you have two nations, they make each other stronger through competition. But if one side gets too strong and knocks out the other, it's going to basically kind of like when you put like all your tubes on one side of a centrifuge, eventually it's going to unbalance the motor and break the whole thing. And that's what happens when you remove that counterbalance. That enemy nation is your nation's counterbalance. It is basically to your sun and moon. Without the moon, there is no sun. That's what it is. It's not that your thing disappears overnight or whatever. It's that what gave it meaning is gone. And people are something that is derived from meaning. And without that meaning, well, they eventually crumble into nothing. They will return from a rock. They will turn to sand. And that is simply the way. Without that counterbalance, you will eventually falter. Your nation will eventually falter. So remember this. Keep your enemy strong and keep yourself strong. That is the way of a wise lord.